What happens when a flashy fashion statement becomes a symbol of rebellion and then an excuse for a violent crackdown? Imagine journeying back to 1940s Los Angeles, a city alive with the pulse of change, neon dreams, and underlying currents of tension. The streets of LA were filled with the energetic hum of a booming metropolis. Men and women, each with their own story, moved about a city that is both glamorous and deeply divided. Amid this backdrop, one particular style stood out: the Zoot Suit. The Zoot Suit was more than just an outfit. It was a bold and public declaration of an identity. Having an oversized jacket, wide-brimmed hats, and extravagantly baggy trousers, the Zoot Suit immediately caught attention. For many young Mexican Americans who wore these suits, it was an act of defiance against a society that continually sought to segregate them. In their eyes, the suit was a statement of pride, a manifestation of a vibrant cultural identity in a city that often denied their rightful place. But while the Zoot Suit was a source of pride and individuality, it swiftly became a lightning rod for racial prejudice. The narrative took a darker turn of dramatic police raids and scenes of unruly street riots. Racial tensions had been simmering, influenced by wartime hysteria and a media eager to inflict fear. Newspapers and radio broadcasts framed a picture of lawlessness, suggesting that the Zoot Suit was an emblem of unpatriotic rebellion. This dangerous stereotype linked Mexican-American youth with criminality and delinquency, setting the stage for one of the most brutal, racially charged events in the history of America, the Zoot Suit Riots. Throughout these riots, the clash between exuberant cultural expression and deep-rooted racism reached an extreme point. As white servicemen and local police entered the streets, their actions quickly escalated into violent confrontations with Mexican-American youth. The riots were not simply a spontaneous eruption of anger, but an explosive result of decades of marginalization, media bias, and an identity struggle amplified by the pressures of wartime America. In this video, we'll delve into the heart of this historic upheaval and explore not just the violence, but the complexity of fashion, racism, and a fight for identity that defined a generation. Subscribe to this channel as we uncover the layers of the Zoot Suit Riots, a story where every thread of fabric carried the weight of resistance and every act of brutality echoed the deep divisions of its time. In the summer of 1943, the streets of Los Angeles erupted into chaos. Mexican-American youth, young men known as Pachucos, became the targets of one of the most brutal and racially charged attacks in American history. Beaten in the streets, stripped of their clothes, hunted down in their neighborhoods. And the worst part? The perpetrators, their attackers, weren't criminals. They were U.S. servicemen, police officers, and even ordinary white citizens. But how did it all begin? How did a fashion statement become a fuel for racial hatred? The Zoot Suit wasn't just clothing. It was a statement. A way for young Mexican Americans and other marginalized communities to assert their identity in a world that wanted to erase them. A world that saw them as second-class citizens. To many white Americans, especially those in positions of power, these baggy suits, these wide-brimmed hats, and these flashy colors were a direct challenge to the hierarchy. They saw them as a threat and an act of defiance. And when fear mixes with prejudice, violence is never far away. While the tensions of World War II still raging, tensions in Los Angeles were already high. The city was a powder keg of racial hostility, economic disparity, and wartime propaganda. And then came the spark. A murder at a place called Sleepy Lagoon, a case built on lies and racial bias, the wrongful conviction of Mexican-American youth. And the media? They did what they do best. They fanned the flames, painting every young Mexican in LA as a criminal. The city turned into chaos. For nearly a week, mobs of uniformed servicemen and white civilians stormed the streets, dragging Mexican-American youth from restaurants, theaters, and even their own homes. They beat them, stripped them naked, burned their Zoot Suits in the streets as symbols of defiance. The police didn't even bother to stop the violence. In many cases, they joined in, and the U.S. government barely acknowledged it. Instead, officials blamed the victims, the young men who had been attacked, brutalized, and dehumanized. But history has a way of repeating itself. The Zoot Suit Riot wasn't just about clothing. It was about power, race, and who gets to belong in America. And in many ways, that fight still isn't over. Los Angeles in the 1940s was a city of contradictions. It was a land of opportunity and booming industry, yet also a place where deep racial divides influenced the daily lives of its people. It was a city that symbolized the promise of the American dream, but only for those who were perceived to be worthy of it. For many, especially Mexican Americans, Black communities, and other marginalized groups, that dream was a little more than an illusion that was constantly overshadowed by racism, segregation, and systemic oppression. The imagery of the bustling streets of 1940s LA was striking, having neon signs illuminating jazz clubs and streetcars rattling past crowded sidewalks. But beneath the surface, the city was deeply segregated. It is a reflection of the racial hierarchy that defined America at the time. At the top were the white elite, business magnates, politicians, and middle-class families who controlled the economy, the legal system, and the housing market. They lived in very conducive neighborhoods like Beverly Hills, Pasadena, and Westwood, which were far from the struggles of the working class. To the south and east, Mexican-American communities were concentrated in barrios like Boyle Heights and East LA, areas filled with vibrant culture but also plagued by underfunded schools, poor infrastructure, and police harassment. Mexican Americans made up a growing share of LA's population. Many of them were descendants of families who had lived in the region for generations, long before California even became a state. But to white society, they were seen as perpetual foreigners, second-class citizens who did not deserve the same rights and privileges as themselves. Meanwhile, Black communities were centered in areas like Watts and South Central, where segregation kept them locked out of wealthier neighborhoods. Like Mexican Americans, Black residents experienced job discrimination and housing restrictions, but they also endured the added cruelty of legalized segregation. Jim Crow-style racism that started from the South into the so-called progressive West. Despite their differences, Mexican Americans and Black Angelenos shared a common struggle, one shaped by economic inequality, systemic racism, and the constant fear of police brutality. The outbreak of World War II in 1939 radically transformed the landscape of Los Angeles, intensifying the racial tensions that had already been simmering beneath the surface. When the U.S. entered the war in 1941, California became a major center for wartime production. LA's factories, shipyards, and military bases suddenly found themselves in desperate need of labor workers. Thousands of young white men were drafted into the military, leaving behind vacancies that needed to be filled. And who stepped in? Mexican Americans, Black workers, and immigrants. The very people who had long been denied stable, well-paying jobs. For the first time, Mexican and Black workers found themselves working in war industries, assembling aircraft, welding ships, and producing weapons for the fight against fascism abroad. But while these jobs offered economic opportunities that had once been out of reach, they also ignited a wave of resentment among white workers who felt that their dominance over the labor force was slipping away. They began to grow hostile. Many white Angelenos refused to work alongside Mexican and Black laborers, and in some cases, companies actively segregated workers to prevent racial conflicts. But tensions didn't just exist in the workplace. They were practiced in the streets, schools, and neighborhoods, creating an atmosphere of widespread hostility. For all the rhetoric about America fighting for democracy overseas, racial minorities in Los Angeles were constantly reminded that they were not included in that promise of freedom. Housing discrimination was one of the most blatant and damaging forms of segregation. In many parts of LA, restrictive housing covenants and legal agreements between property owners explicitly barred Mexican, Black, and Asian families from buying or renting homes in white neighborhoods. If a Mexican American or Black family tried to move into a white area, they were often met with violent resistance. Cross burnings, vandalism, and mobs threatening minority families became a common occurrence. The Los Angeles real estate market ensured that minorities remained confined to overcrowded, neglected neighborhoods, where landlords charged high rents but refused to maintain the properties. And then there was the Los Angeles Police Department, LAPD, an institution notorious for its brutality and deep-rooted racism. Mexican and black youth were constantly harassed by police officers who saw them as troublemakers and criminals before they even committed a crime. The LAPD operated as an occupying force in minority neighborhoods, routinely conducting mass arrests and beatings under the guise of keeping the streets safe and secure. One of the most notorious figures at the time was Police Chief Clements B. Harral, who led the LAPD with an iron fist. Under his leadership, the department embraced a policy of racial profiling, using fabricated reports and exaggerated crime statistics to justify the mass arrests of Mexican-American youth. The department frequently worked hand-in-hand with local newspapers to paint an image of lawless Mexican gangs terrorizing the city, an image that would later justify the violence of the Zoot Suit Riots. The LAPD's racism was particularly evident in the way officers policed white sailors and soldiers versus Mexican-American youth. While white servicemen were often allowed to get away with drunken, disorderly conduct, vandalism, and even outright assaults, Mexican-American teenagers were immediately labeled as threats, arrested, and thrown into overcrowded jails. The tension between these groups began to escalate, and everyone in Los Angeles could feel it. By the early 1940s, all the ingredients for disaster were in place. A divided city where minorities were treated as second-class citizens. A war economy that shifted racial dynamics, creating resentment among whites. A police force that saw Mexican-American youth as enemies rather than citizens. And a media machine that fanned the flames of racial fear and paranoia. And at the center of it all came a fashion statement that became a symbol of defiance: the Zoot Suit. For many young Mexican Americans, the Zoot Suit was more than just clothing. It was an act of rebellion, a statement of pride, a refusal to conform to a society that tried to erase them. But to the white establishment, it was a threat, a sign of a dangerous youth culture that needed to be controlled, punished, and erased. No one knew it yet, but Los Angeles was a ticking time bomb, and it didn't take much to set it off. The Zoot Suit Riots were just around the corner, and the city was about to explode in one of the most brutal racial conflicts in American history. Los Angeles in the 1940s was a glamorous city, yet deeply divided, promising opportunity, yet withholding it from so many. The racial tensions, police brutality, and economic inequality had all been building for years. And soon it only took one spark to ignite an all-out war in the streets. The Zoot Suit Riots weren't just a spontaneous eruption of violence. They were the result of years of discrimination, systemic oppression, and a city that refused to acknowledge the humanity of its people. And when that moment finally arrived, it revealed the ugly truth about race in America. A truth that still echoes today. In the early 1940s, a bold and defiant fashion trend flooded the streets of Los Angeles. One that turned heads, sparked controversy, and ultimately ignited violence. The Zoot Suit wasn't just clothing, it was a statement. With its oversized jacket that rolled down past the knees, high-waisted baggy trousers that narrowed at the ankles, and wide-brimmed fedora tilted just right, the Zoot Suit was impossible to ignore. It exudes confidence, swagger, rebellion. It was flashy, exaggerated, and deliberately excessive at a time when the rest of America was being told to ration, to sacrifice. But for young Mexican Americans who called themselves Pachucos, this suit was more than a fashion choice, it was an identity. To the Pachuco youth, wearing a Zoot Suit was an act of self-expression. It was a way to reclaim space in a society that tried to erase them. They lived in a world that constantly reminded them that they were outsiders, treated them as second-class citizens in a country they called home. But in the clubs, on the dance floors, and in the streets of East LA, the Zoot Suit was their badge of honor. It wasn't just about fashion, it was about power. The Zoot Suit was a way of saying, "We are here, we belong, we will not be ignored." But to mainstream white society, the message wasn't just heard, it was feared. To many white Americans, especially those in positions of power, the Zoot Suit was dangerous. It was seen as a rejection of traditional American values, a slap in the face to the wartime spirit of sacrifice and discipline. While young white men were being drafted to fight overseas, Mexican-American youth were wearing suits that defied the era's strict wartime conservatism. And the government? They took notice. During World War II, the U.S. had implemented strict rationing policies. Wool, fabric, and other materials were limited, and Americans were expected to make do with less for the war effort. The War Production Board even regulated clothing sizes, shorter jackets, narrower lapels, and less fabric. The Zoot Suit? It laughed in the face of these restrictions. Its long, flowing fabric wasn't just a style, it was a rebellion against wartime conformity. That was all the excuse the media and authorities needed to demonize the look. Newspapers blasted Zoot Suiters as unpatriotic, wasteful, and criminal. They were painted as street thugs, gangsters, and troublemakers. Stories circulated about Mexican-American youth terrorizing the city, reinforcing racial stereotypes, and fueling the public's growing fear and resentment. Soon, it wasn't just a fashion statement, it was a target. Police went down hard on Zoot Suiters, often arresting them for simply wearing their clothes. Mexican-American youth were accused of being delinquents, gangsters, and a threat to public safety, whether or not they had committed any crime. The LAPD made it a mission to sweep the streets of so-called hoodlums, which was an expression that just meant young men in Zoot Suits. Meanwhile, the media fanned the flames. Journalists described Zoot Suiters in terms meant to dehumanize them. Words like wolves, rats, and savages were used to describe teenage boys who were guilty of nothing more than just having a different sense of dressing. The more the media pushed the narrative, the more the public turned against them. And then came the breaking point. The city of Los Angeles was already a pressure cooker of racial tensions, but the demonization of the Zoot Suit turned Mexican-American youth into public enemies. All it took was a spark to set the city ablaze. The Zoot Suit riot was just around the corner. How did the riots start? June 3, 1943. In 1943, Los Angeles was a city at war, both abroad and at home. While the world focused on World War II, another battle was forming in the streets of LA. Tensions had been rising for years, with Mexican-American youth, especially with the Pachucos being portrayed as outsiders, troublemakers, and even internal enemies. All it took was a single spark to ignite a full-scale racial war. That spark came on the night of June 3, 1943. A group of white sailors from a nearby military base, drunk and spoiling for trouble, roamed the streets of Los Angeles. They despised the Zoot Suits, seeing them as flamboyant, unpatriotic, and disrespectful at a time when the country was rationing fabric for the war effort. But beyond the clothing, it was about race, power, and a city that was divided by prejudice. The sailors soon encountered a small group of young Mexican Americans in Zoot Suits. Quickly, an argument erupted. Although the details remain blurry, some say the sailors provoked the Pachucos, while others claim the Pachucos stood their ground. What is clear is that fists began to fly. A sailor fell to the ground, and the others saw red. Words of it began to spread quickly, and within hours, hundreds of servicemen gathered seeking revenge. Armed with clubs, belts, and even knives, they stormed into Mexican neighborhoods, looking for any Zoot-suited youth they could find. As the night unfolded, the attack became more intense. The police did nothing about the situation. Some officers encouraged the violence. Instead of arresting the rampaging sailors, they arrested the victims. Mexican-American youth who were bloodily beaten on the sidewalks. The city was on the edge of chaos, and this was just the beginning. The following night, Los Angeles had become a war zone. The streets pulsed with fear and hatred as mobs of white servicemen, now over 200 in number, took the riots to another level. They didn't just target young men in Zoot Suits, they targeted the entire community. June 4th to 7th saw some of the most horrifying racial violence in LA's history. Sailors flooded into Mexican neighborhoods, dragging men from their homes, beating them in the streets, and tearing the zoot suits from their bodies before setting them on fire. The violence was sickeningly public. Throngs of white onlookers gathered to cheer as the assaults went on. The attacks weren't just against Mexican Americans. Black and Filipino men were also brutalized. Anyone who looked different became a target. The rage wasn't about crime or patriotism. It was about asserting dominance. Police presence should have brought order, but instead, it deepened the injustice and made matters worse. Officers watched from the sidelines, doing little to stop the mobs. When arrests were made, they were almost exclusively Mexican-American youth who had been attacked. The message was clear: the system was against them. The riots raged for days, growing increasingly brutal. By June 7th, hundreds of victims lay in hospital beds, nursing broken ribs, fractured skulls, and deep lacerations. Some had barely escaped with their lives. Yet in the newspapers, the coverage was shockingly biased. Headlines portrayed the Pachucos as gangsters and the servicemen as heroes cleaning up the city. The truth was buried beneath layers of racism and propaganda. As the riot continued, city officials and law enforcement mixed the whole story to control the narrative. Instead of acknowledging the brutal attacks on Mexican-American youth, the Los Angeles Police Department framed the victims as the real threat. LA Police Chief Clements B. Harrell doubled down on the idea that Mexican-American youth were dangerous gang members. He labeled the Pachucos as juvenile delinquents and suggested that their criminal tendencies were to blame for the violence. This wasn't just an isolated opinion, it was a coordinated effort to shift blame and justify the unchecked brutality against colored people. The police were not alone in their complicity. California Governor Earl Warren and military officials remained silent, instead of condemning the white servicemen who had instigated the riots. The government's response was chilling in its indifference. No sailor was arrested, and no military leader was punished. Instead, the city of Los Angeles chose an outrageous solution. They banned the zoot suit. A couple weeks after the riots, LA authorities made it illegal to wear the outfit in public. Tailors were warned not to sell the suits, and anyone seen wearing them was at risk of immediate arrest. The city punished the victims rather than punishing the attackers. The message was clear. Mexican-American youth had no place in Los Angeles unless they conformed, remained invisible, and abandoned their cultural identity. The horror of the Zoot Suit Riots didn't stop at the borders of Los Angeles. In a matter of weeks, the racial violence had spread across the country. White servicemen, emboldened by their actions in LA, carried their hatred to other cities, turning their attacks into a nationwide movement of terror. Between June and July of 1943, similar riots broke out in Detroit, New York, and Texas. In each of these cities, Black and Latino communities found themselves under siege. The formula was the same. Mobs of white servicemen and civilians rampaged through communities of color, beating men in the streets, vandalizing homes, and terrorizing families. The targets weren't criminals or gang members. They were simply people who looked different. In Detroit, the violence reached its peak when racial tensions escalated into full-scale riots between black residents and white mobs. Instead of the police to protect black citizens, they remained idle or even joined in the violence. By the end of the Detroit riots, 34 people were dead, 25 of them black. In New York, sailors attacked Puerto Rican and black communities. In Texas, similar attacks targeted Mexican-American neighborhoods. The Zoot Suit Riots had revealed an ugly truth about America. Racial violence was not just an isolated incident in Los Angeles, it was part of a larger, systemic problem that stretched across the country. As reports of these riots circulated, America was forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. The war was being fought overseas in the name of democracy and freedom, yet at home, racial oppression and white supremacy ruled the streets. The hypocrisy was impossible to ignore. The Zoot Suit Riots weren't just a series of violent nights in LA. It was a warning, a glimpse into the deep racial divide that had been festering in America for generations. And though the riot eventually ended, its impact rippled through history, leaving a painful legacy that is still felt today. Conclusion: the Zoot Suit Riots were more than just racial clashes. They were a direct attack on identity, culture, and the right to exist without fear. What started as a simple confrontation between a group of sailors and Mexican-American youth turned into a citywide and later nationwide wave of violence that exposed the raw, unchecked racism at the heart of the American society. Even today, echoes of the Zoot Suit Riots persist. They remind us of the dangers of racial scapegoating, of media-fueled hysteria, and of a justice system that too often protects the powerful while criminalizing the oppressed. This is a story that must never be forgotten, because history has a way of repeating itself. And the only way to prevent it is to face the truth head-on. While the smoke cleared and the bruises healed, the battle over the truth had just begun. The mainstream media wasted no time in twisting the narrative, turning a brutal racial assault into a so-called patriotic stand. Newspaper headlines across the country painted the Zoot Suit Riots as a necessary crackdown on lawlessness, with publications like the Los Angeles Times portraying Mexican-American youth as the real aggressors. Instead of reporting on the violent mobs of white servicemen rampaging through the streets, newspapers described them as cleaning up the city, painting their actions as a defense against un-American delinquents. The real story, the unprovoked beatings, the stripping of pachucos in the streets, and the racial motivations behind the attacks was buried beneath a wave of propaganda. Even Hollywood played its part. Films from the 1940s and beyond continued to push a dangerous stereotype of the pachuco, depicting young Mexican Americans as knife-wielding gangsters and troublemakers. The cultural fear of the Zoot Suit, which had been manufactured and exaggerated by the press, was now deeply embedded in American media. The riots were rewritten as a war against crime, ignoring the clear racial and classist undertones that had caused the violence. In the eyes of the mainstream, the white servicemen who attacked Mexican-American youth were simply doing their patriotic duty, while the victims of these assaults were labeled as the enemy. Despite overwhelming evidence of racial violence, law enforcement and political leaders refused to acknowledge the truth. Days after the riots, the city of Los Angeles effectively banned the wearing of zoot suits in public, treating the clothing as if it were the cause of the violence rather than a symbol of resistance. Instead of protecting the victims, the system chose to erase their identity, reinforcing the idea that simply existing as a proud Mexican American was somehow a criminal act. But history has a way of always resurfacing the truth. While the mainstream media attempted to erase the voices of the victims, Mexican Americans refused to be silenced. If anything, the riots ignited a new wave of activism and cultural pride, inspiring a civil rights movement that would stretch across decades. The brutality of the riots had exposed the realities of racism in America, and the Mexican American community was no longer willing to accept second-class status. Chicano activists emerged in full force, using the riots as a rallying cry for justice. Organizations like the Community Service Organization, CSO, and later the Chicano movement of the 1960s and 70s drew direct inspiration from the struggle of the Pachuco generation. They demanded equal rights, an end to police brutality, and representation in government and media. Art, literature, and music became powerful tools of resistance. Murals depicting Pachucos as heroes, not criminals, began to appear across Los Angeles, reclaiming their place in history. Writers and poets captured the defiance and pain of the Zoot Suit era, ensuring that the voices of those who had been attacked in 1943 would never be forgotten. Protesters marched through the streets carrying signs that read, "Somos Mexicanos, no criminales," meaning, "We are Mexicans, not criminals." Perhaps most importantly, the riots solidified the Chicano identity. Rather than allowing themselves to be erased or assimilated, young Mexican Americans began to embrace their heritage with renewed vigor. The Pachuco culture that was once demonized by the media became a source of pride. Their distinctive slang, their style, their music, all of it became part of a cultural movement that demanded respect and recognition. The riots may have been an attempt to strip Mexican Americans of their dignity, but instead they ignited a movement that refused to back down, one that was even stronger. Though the Zoot Suit Riots took place in the 1940s, their impact has not completely faded. The Zoot Suit itself, which was once criminalized and ridiculed, evolved into a powerful symbol of resistance. Decades later, in the 1970s, the resurgence of Chicano activism brought the style back into the spotlight. It was no longer just a fashion statement, but now a reminder of a past struggle, a piece of history that is worn with pride. The riots also left a lasting imprint on pop culture. Films like Zoot Suit, 1981, based on the play by Luis Valdez, told the story from the perspective of Mexican Americans reclaiming the narrative from decades of whitewashing. The play and film highlighted the injustices of the 1940s while celebrating the resilience of the community. The music industry also paid homage to the era. Chicano rock and jazz musicians infused their work with nods to the Pachuco culture, ensuring that the sound and style of resistance lived on. Even outside of the Mexican-American community, the Zoot Suit became a universal symbol of defiance against oppression. From the swing revival movements to hip-hop fashion, the exaggerated style of the Zoot Suit has been embraced by various subcultures that see it as a representation of rebellion against an unjust system. Its presence in mainstream media, from music videos to period films, serves as a reminder that history does not simply vanish. It evolves, adapts, and continues to inspire generations to come. But beyond fashion and pop culture, the real legacy of the Zoot Suit Riots is in the fight for racial justice that continues to this day. The issues that fueled the riots, racial profiling, media bias, and police brutality, are still very much alive. The struggle of the Pachuco generation paved the way for future civil rights battles, from the Chicano movement to modern-day fights against racial injustice. Each time history threatens to repeat itself, the lessons of 1943 come alive, reminding us of the dangers of allowing fear and prejudice to dictate who belongs in America. The Zoot Suit Riots were never just about clothing. They were about identity, about resistance, and about a community refusing to be erased. And though the riots may have been framed as a footnote in history by those who sought to control the narrative, the truth lives on in the voices of those who remember, in the art that tells the real story, and in the continued fight for justice that carries their spirit forward. The Zoot Suit that was once a target of racial violence remains a symbol of defiance, resilience, and the unbreakable spirit of a people who refused to be silenced. It stands as a testament to the power of cultural pride in the face of oppression, and in every mural, in every song, in every act of resistance that follows. The legacy of the Zoot Suit Riot still lives on. The fight isn't over. Today, the legacy of the riots lives on in the strength of Chicano culture, in peaceful protests, and in the unwavering demand for equality. We must learn from history because if we don't, we risk repeating it. If this story is worth fighting for, don't let it end here. Share this history, educate others, and stand against racism wherever it exists. And if you want more deep dives into the hidden truths of history, like, comment, and subscribe. Let's continue unraveling the past together.